Hi guys, and welcome to Hack Your Health. I'm Erica, and today I'm doing a video on the available clinical studies of the Specific Carbohydrate Diet. So I found 4, and I didn't include anything that was already in the book, Breaking the Vicious Cycle, because that's already really easy to find. I kind of wanted to find some that weren't included in that book so that people could have a bit more information available to them if they were considering doing this or in the research portion of learning about it to see if it's right for them. So I found 4 studies, 1 in adults and 3 in children. And I think the reason why it's easier to find studies that are done in children is because it's more common to start children out on this elemental kind of diet, like a liquid diet, instead of going straight to medication, probably because of the side effects, and children are more sensitive a lot of the time. And so it's probably easier to get approved for a nutritional study in children than adults because there's already kind of something similar that's fairly standard for them, whereas for adults, that enteral, I think it's called, or like elemental diet is a lot less common. So that's kind of the sense I got from reading some of the introductions. So I'll start with the one with adults. So this is sort of the notes that somebody had published on a lecture that they gave in 2011. And so this was done at the University of Massachusetts and had 11 patients enrolled in this study. So this one had a bit less information since it was just lecture notes, but essentially they were looking to see whether they could induce a clinical remission in these patients without the use of the anti-TNF drugs, which basically are sort of suppressing your immune response. And they found that out of 11 people in the study, 9 of them were able to, they could be managed without that medication while on the specific carbohydrate diet. So they had the option of cooking classes, and they also had 5 meetings with a dietitian as well. Before they started, they were each educated about the diet. And they did it between 6 and 10 months was the duration that these patients did it. And 9 out of 10 no longer needed their medication. So I think the results in that are pretty good. And it also kind of indicates what might be necessary for a lot of people to do this successfully is the kind of support that they made available to these patients. The education, the follow-ups, and the kind of ongoing opportunity to discuss the diet with an expert. And they did note that even though 9 out of 10 of them were able to be managed without medication, 100% of them improved. So even the ones that still needed medication were improved over how they were at the beginning of the study by doing the diet. So the next study that I'll go into was done in February of 2018. That's when it was published. So this is very recent. And it was done at the Seattle Children's Hospital, and they also took 2 patients from the Digestive Healthcare and Children's Center of Atlanta. So most of these patients were in Seattle, and I think 2 of them were in Atlanta. These researchers were particularly interested in mapping the microbiome and how it, in Crohn's patients, when they map the microbiome, which means that they basically take a stool sample and see the genetic material that's there. So each different kind of bacteria will have a different sort of gene code, and by looking at that, they can see what a person's microbiome is like. And when they've done that in other studies, they found that people with Crohn's disease had different microbiome that was not normal. So these researchers were interested to see not only if the patient had different symptoms and they got better, but if the microbiome also changed to be more in line with what a healthy person's would look like. So that's something that they were studying in this particular clinical trial. So in this study, they actually only took patients who weren't taking any other medication. So this was where the specific carbohydrate diet was the only treatment being received by these patients for this period of time. And I think it needed to be for at least 1 month before the study started, if I remember correctly. And these were children, and there were 12 of them aged 10 to 17. They and their families received training at the beginning and counseling at each visit by a dietitian. And they also used a stage approach of introducing the food. So they didn't just go straight into the full diet. They started with a more basic version of the specific carbohydrate diet and then gradually introduced foods as they went along with the guidance of the dietitian that was helping them. And they did a follow-up at 2, 4, 8, and 12 weeks. So this included half female, half male, and they were both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis patients in this study. They didn't notice any adverse effects, so no side effects. However, there were 2 patients that, due to the difficulty of maintaining the diet, dropped out. And after 2 weeks, their first checkup, 5 out of 12, at this point they were all in the study still, 5 out of 12 of them had reached a clinical remission. And at 8 weeks, 8 of the remaining patients were in remission. So at 12 weeks, there were 10 patients left, and 8 of them were in a clinical remission. And for 2 of the patients, the diet therapy was not considered effective. So in this study, really it's 8 out of 10. 8 of them were in remission after 12 weeks, and 2 of them were not. And this actually maps on pretty closely, even though this was a very small sample size. This maps on closely to what Elaine Gottschall wrote in her book, which is that it's effective for about 85% of cases. So this is pretty close to that. So they also were measuring whether they gained or lost weight, because that's very important in children with these diseases especially. And 7 out of 10 of them gained weight, and 3 out of 10 of them lost weight. But it wasn't clear whether any of them were overweight or whether they were all underweight at the beginning. But overall, that seems fairly good that 7 out of 10 of them did gain weight. And all except for 1 of the patients had improvement or normalization of the stool microbiome at the 2-week follow-up visit. And they noted in this study that the microbiome can actually change really quickly. So I guess that's why they tested it at 2 weeks. And by 12 weeks, only 2 of the 10 remaining patients still had elevated C-reactive protein. And that is basically when you take a blood test, when that's elevated, it means that you have a high level of inflammation in your body. And of course, inflammation is an indication that you have active Crohn's or something else happening. One of those diseases is very likely to be active. And since only 2 of them still had elevated levels of C-reactive protein, that's a good sign that it had drastically reduced the inflammation in their body. And what I should have said at the beginning of this, and I forgot, is, I'm not a doctor, and actually I have a philosophy background, so even though I can read these and interpret them, not all of the science and medical literature is going to make complete sense to me, and I wouldn't take this interpretation as medical advice. This is just trying to kind of make it easier for people to research, and definitely read these yourself in the description and look at as much information as you can find while making a decision. Because like I said, I'm not a doctor, and if you are a doctor or medically educated, you'll probably get a lot more out of reading these. I just kind of read them and then looked a lot at the conclusion to kind of find this information that's easily shareable. And my goal is more to see how effective this was, not necessarily all of the specific measurements of what changed. So there's a lot more information in the actual studies. So in this study, They also went more into how the specific carbohydrate diet, because it's eliminating so many processed foods, is also eliminating other things that the children could be reacting to, and they used emulsifiers as an example. So in a different study, emulsifiers such as polysorbate 80 were found to induce colitis in rats, or was it mice? I think it was mice that were predisposed genetically to colitis. So they kind of wondered that maybe the lack of exposure to emulsifiers and other things that can cause damage may also be part of why the specific carbohydrate diet was effective. And like all of these studies, they basically said more research is needed to see why these results happened, or to get a larger group to study or whatever. But that was kind of an interesting point that was made in this article. So yeah, that was largely positive results. 8 out of 10 were in remission. So January 2014, this one's also from Seattle, Department of Pediatrics and University of Washington, Seattle. So this was 7 children, and they all had Crohn's disease, and they were retrospectively evaluated. These children were on the specific carbohydrate diet for between 5 and 30 months, depending on each one, and they were evaluated after 3 months. So they weren't sure when the symptoms actually resolved, because they'd had their first follow-up at 3 months. But they did notice that all symptoms were notably resolved at that first follow-up visit, and that each patient's lab indicators, so that would be basically blood tests and things like that, had either normalized or improved at that first visit. So that was the case for all 7 of them. And that's all I wrote down for that one. So October 2014, this one was Children's Center for Digestive Healthcare in Atlanta, Georgia. And the university was the Pediatric Gastroenterology Unit at the University of Rome in Italy. In this study, they offered it to 16 patients. 3 declined. 3 weren't able to swallow they were swallowing a camera that would watch their mucosal healing. So the mucosal lining is basically on the inside of the intestinal walls, and that's basically what's damaged by these ulcerations that are happening. So they were trying to see whether that mucosal lining was healing in this study. That was their main area of interest. So 3 of them couldn't participate because they were unable to swallow the camera, and 1 dropped out partway through. And so there were 9 people that successfully completed this study. So they were between the ages of 10 and 17. There were 7 boys and 2 girls. And their average disease duration had been 3.2 years, but there was a very big range. Some of them were very newly diagnosed, and some of them had had it for up to 8 years. So this was a 12-week trial. There were 3 patients who had never been medicated, 4 taking immunomodulators, 1 taking mescaline, and 1 taking budesonide, and I might be saying these medications wrong. And none of them were taking biologics or other steroids. So this was an interesting one because it combined some patients who were not taking medication and some that were, and they just made sure that they kept the ones that were medicated. They didn't change their medication throughout the trial. So this is still basically measuring the effectiveness of the diet, even though they were taking medications, because the medication remained constant throughout. And they focused on people that were still flaring even though they were taking the medication. So at the beginning of the study, they were on average meeting 85% of their caloric needs, and at the 12-week point, they were meeting 101% of their estimated caloric needs. So these patients, either because of increased appetite or for whatever other reason, actually were meeting more of their caloric needs after 12 weeks on the diet than they had been before they started it. So out of them, 3 of them did lose weight, but the majority of them gained weight, and a dietitian was available to them by phone at all times. So these people also had access to education about the diet and ongoing support. So once they swallowed this camera, they found that 4 out of 10 of them had mucosal healing, and 8 out, that would, what they were saying, it sounds like they meant complete mucosal healing. And 8 out of 10 showed significant mucosal improvement. 6 patients after 12 weeks were in clinical remission, but only 3 of those had normal mucosal lining. So it's interesting that even though they were in remission, they still had some healing to be done, and that would be only noticeable by kind of looking at it through the camera like that. And both those patients who were receiving and not receiving medication showed improvements in this study. So that's quite encouraging for people who are already on medication to know that they can still have further improvements by doing this diet without having to stop their medication. So you can heal without having to go through that risk of unmedicating yourself. Those are basically the studies that I was able to find, and hopefully that gives a bit of insight into it's not necessarily 100% of the time every single person magically gets better. There are difficulties involved, which is kind of shown by the number of people that weren't able to complete the study. In each study there was someone who seemed to drop out, or in most of them. And in a couple of them, I also mentioned that some of the participants had actually admitted to not completely following the diet. They would cheat on it every so often, so it's hard to say how that would factor into the results. So honesty is also something that needs to be factored into these kinds of dietary studies, because it's quite common for people to cheat a little bit, even though it's suggested that you follow it strictly. And the mucosal healing I thought was interesting, because even though they seem to go into remission very quickly, these people, in the book, Elaine Gottschall recommends doing it for at least a year and even up to, say, 3 years for Crohn's patients. And maybe that's kind of an indicator of how long it really takes to heal. But like I said, I'm not a doctor. This is just my thoughts. It seems like this has been pretty, of all the people, it seems like most of these studies are in children, and they didn't note any side effects. Most of them gained weight, although some of them didn't. So it seems like there's a lot of interest in studying this in children, and there's other planned studies. Most of them are also in children that haven't been published, that are still seeking patients. So I noticed that while I was online, there were several that were looking for people to participate in these studies. So when I did this diet, 5 or maybe 6 years ago now, all of these ones that are in 2014 hadn't been published. So it looks like there's now more interest being taken in actually doing clinical studies on the specific carbohydrate diet, which I was happy and surprised to discover. So if you're watching this in the future, maybe there's other stuff. So I'll link the studies all below, and hopefully if you're researching this can be encouraging that it's not just a bunch of flakes, that people at universities are also interested in this diet. And even though these are small studies, the percentage of people that have achieved remission is actually quite high, and in comparison with other drugs, it's actually very good, because no drug is 100% of the people got better. So you're not comparing it to 100% success rate anyways, but there's no side effects in the traditional sense. There is the side effect of needing to restrict your diet, and that can be challenging, but it's not the kinds of side effects where another illness is caused or allergic reactions and stuff like that. Thanks so much for watching, and if you'd like to see more health-related videos, please be sure to subscribe, and if you like this video, please let me know by pushing like. And if you found any other studies that you'd like to share with other viewers, or I myself would be interested in reading them as well, then please post them in the comments. If you've had success yourself, everybody's always interested in learning about that. Yeah, if there's anything else you'd like to share. Thank you so much for watching, and best of luck on your healing journey. Okay, bye.